So DFV Workaware has developed 2 resources that you can use in the workplace. The first one is called When Domestic and Family Violence Comes to Work. It's a booklet. Booklet sounds like it's a little pamphlet, but it's actually a pretty chunky 30 or so pages. And so that first one has been updated with a new prevention section in partnership with Ending Violence Against Women Queensland. Now within there, we haven't touched so much on this in this presentation, but I will flag it. In that booklet, it does talk about the risk assessment process you can take using a work health and safety approach. So that's where you identify the hazards, you can how does it go? Identify the risks, the hazards, putting in a control mechanism in place and so on. And that's approach you would traditionally used for something like a chemical spill, but it can be transferred to a domestic and family violence situation, and it can complement these safety planning tools and any conversations you're having. And that can include where there's been a disclosure that someone in the workplace is using violence, for example. So if you just Google Work Health Safety Queensland Risk Assessment, you'll actually find really clear information about how to step through each stage of a risk assessment about a workplace hazard. And domestic and family violence at work is a workplace safety issue. So the booklet that we're going to focus on now is the second one, and it's called the DFV Workaware Safety Planning Tools. So I'm not going to go through it, blow by blow. Which is probably inappropriate language in this forum. I've just realised it's, it's an example of how language that's ingrained in us just kind of comes out. So I won't go through it dot point by dot point. I'll pick out key points and highlight examples of the tool in action. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. So as before, please make a note of any questions you have along the way, and then we can work through those. So as I've flagged before, you really don't have to go through a safety assessment, risk assessment and safety planning process on your own. You can consult with other agencies to prepare for using the tool with an employee. So you can contact Working Women Queensland here at Basic Rights Queensland. You could contact your union office. So for example, the Services Union. You can contact local domestic and family violence services, as well as state and national helplines to help you prepare for having a conversation with an employee. So on page 31 of this guide, there's a quick guide. So if you're kind of not wanting to go through the whole thing again, page 31 is a quick guide to help prepare you to have a conversation with an employee when you've noticed their issues and you're wanting to talk things through with them. Now, when you do have a conversation with an employee about their experience of domestic and family violence, we want to bring all relevant information to that conversation. So bring the safety planning tool with you, bring the policy with you, bring the enterprise agreement with you, bring contact details for domestic and family violence services with you. And as I keep saying, remembering it may not be safe for the victim survivor to take any of that information with them. So letting them know they can come back and get that information again and again as needed. And sometimes workplaces can provide secure storage for important documents or information for a member of staff if that's useful too. Another thing to think of is to bring a trauma-aware approach to any conversation with an employee. So remember that they may not be able to share information in a chronological order, and they may have difficulty remembering information. When you're having a conversation with them, offer breaks so that they can take a deep breath, go to the bathroom if they need to. A little thing, but something that can be really helpful, is to check if they want the door open or the door closed, because whether it's open or closed or not might trigger a trauma response in them. And you can also invite them to have a support person with them in the meeting. And that might be a health and safety representative, it might be a union delegate or a colleague or someone else. So when we're sitting down with a person with this tool, the first thing we're going to do is explain the tool to them. So this, something like this is a form we're going to go through together to understand how domestic and family violence might impact you at work and the steps we can take as an organisation to support you at work. Then we want to obtain ongoing consent throughout this process. So we want to ask for consent at the start of each new section. Is it okay if we keep going through this, as an example? and be transparent about that. So you can say, I'm going to ask for your consent as we go through this process. It's really okay for you to say no to some questions or going through certain sections. That's really okay. So if we put that in context, someone who's experiencing domestic and family violence is frequently in a situation where their consent is not considered important by the person using violence. So this is an opportunity for us to support that person in their self-determination and really have some say over what they share and don't share and what direction this conversation takes. And that's all about dignity and self-determination. So this section, even though it can seem a little administrative, the workplace emergency and contact details, which is on page 11, is actually quite important. So it's an opportunity for the victim survivor to respond to questions they may have more confidence answering and to help them feel comfortable as the safety planning process unfolds. So it's just a gentle step into it. It is important to update emergency contact and next of kin details, because if the person using violence is the person contacted when there's an incident of domestic and family violence in the workplace, that's an issue. So we want to update those details. This is where we can establish clear and safe communication processes in the workplace. And that clarity is really important, particularly where someone may have been impacted by trauma. They may not be able to hold really complex processes in their head. So having really clear and straightforward communication processes is helpful. And again, we want to be mindful that the victim survivors' communications might be monitored. As I've flagged over and over again, so I won't go into that again. So we'll jump to the next slide. Thanks, Stacey. So this is part 2. And part 2 might seem like quite a bit, but the idea here is to follow it step by step. And of course, not all sections may be relevant to that one person, so you may not have to do the whole thing. So I'm going to highlight some key considerations for part 2 of this safety assessment questionnaire, and that starts on page 13. So remember, there's a notes section under each group of questions. So you use that to record the contextual information that goes with the yes/no responses. Remind yourself too that this is not a personal safety plan. This is a workplace safety plan. It can dovetail a personal safety plan, but the responsibility in the workplace isn't to respond to everything happening in someone's life. It is about workplace safety. As I flag, confidentiality is something to bear in mind throughout all of this process, and to always be asking the question, who has access to this information? So some strategies that might be useful to consider in section 3 of part 2, makes it sound like I'm talking about legislation, section this, part that. Strategies that might be helpful could be relocating to a position that's not visible by the public. So someone might be sitting by a window that's easily visible from the road. Might be relocating them to a different work site if that's possible. Could be providing access to the pool of work cars to minimise the risk of stalking by having unpredictable cars that they're having access to. And that's something we know an employer was using with one of their staff members. Supplying a duress alarm. So it could be, this is another example we had, someone who was separated from their partner, but where there was a risk of they were certainly in danger from that other person. So they actually had a duress alarm that they were able to wear to and from work in case something came up. Another option could be to supply a phone with pre-programmed numbers if that's a safe option. So there's quite a few different things. And again, asking that person what they need is a really great starting point. Now, there are some services that might be particularly useful for the victim survivor if they're applying for a domestic violence order or seeking to vary a domestic violence order. So, for example, a domestic violence order might be able to cover the workplace, which may be an added layer of protection. And we'll leave conversation about DVOs and effectiveness and so on for another time. But this is a step that could be taken to provide information about legal services they could contact to discuss this. So that could be Women's Legal Service Queensland is a key contact there, and the Women's Violence Prevention Team at Legal Aid is another key contact in that space as well. Now in section 5, confidentiality is also really important here when you're gathering information about the person who's using violence. So we want to store any details or photos securely where they're not available on public display. So it's very much a need to know basis, and it's just stored securely either physically or electronically. And then when we come to section 7 about contact officers, that might seem quite straightforward. Well, that person in HR is the person that you talk to, but it could be helpful to ask the victim survivor, are there any barriers that you see in being able to have a conversation with that person? Because if there's some sort of history of workplace conflict, or it may be someone who doesn't feel comfortable talking to a person of the other gender or something like that, that might be a barrier. So along the way, we're also looking for barriers that might prevent a person from seeking assistance. So we'll jump to the next slide. So this is continuing part 2. We're up to page 19 now, I think. So these sections are fairly self-explanatory, but I'll highlight some bits in particular. So when section 8 around employee entitlements, again, it's really important to ask the victim survivor what they want and need for themselves, because they'll have a pretty good idea. But if they're uncertain, then that's when you can offer suggestions. It can be helpful to consider their job. So, for example, it might be quite difficult for them to do some aspects of their work due to trauma and impacts of domestic and family violence. So one example could be in a community services organisation where a frontline worker doesn't feel able to work with clients experiencing domestic and family violence. They might not have clients with those experiences assigned to them, although if that's the only thing your organisation does, that becomes challenging. But again, that's one example. As we flagged already, do remember that needs for leave can really vary from worker to worker. It might be small regular chunks, or it might be big chunks of leave that are needed. We have highlighted specifically section 10, travelling to and from work. And the reason for that is because that's a time when a person may be at heightened risk of harm from a person who's using violence against them. Their movements can be quite predictable in their travelling to and from work, and they might be quite isolated from support. So they may be alone in a car, they may be driving a very long way without other people around, and so on. So this is where we really want to do some safety planning if this is a risk. And there are different strategies here. The pool cars, as we've mentioned before, some organisations have set up an Uber account. It's staggering or changing work start and end times to make things less predictable. There's all sorts of strategies that can be adopted there. And then section 13, I've also highlighted as well. And that's again one of the tricky ones, which is what if the victim survivor and the person using violence are both employees? And that can be particularly tricky if they are, for example, in the case of intimate partner violence, still in a relationship and living together. That adds another layer of complexity there. The first suggestion is to consult your local domestic and family violence service for information and support specific to that situation. Seek legal advice. So again, Women's Legal Service and legal aid. Do consider any domestic violence orders that may be in place. So for example, one employee may be in breach of the conditions of a DVO if their duties or their location of work allow them contact with the victim survivor. So we need to take DVOs into account in the workplace in this situation. And then you can look at strategies to consider separating employees. So it might be transferring someone to a different section or varying work hours or something like that. But again, it's case by case and seek that advice specific to your individual circumstances in the workplace. So then we move on to documenting agreed actions. So it's another important section. It allows us to plan, to review what we've done, to continue to improve. Things to bear in mind here is that you or other employees may be witnesses in court proceedings. And so documentation will assist you to recall what happened and when. The documents themselves may be potentially used as evidence in court proceedings. And documentation also provides accountability around who will do what and when. And having the employee be part of that, and signing off on it provides an opportunity for the employee to have ownership of the plan. Just a key thing to remember there, when you're documenting things, write notes factually and accurately. So I combine that to make it facturately, so that they're not emotive. So this is the employee disclosed this on this date at this time, and the action that was taken was this, not something really emotive about this such and such said this terrible thing and it was awful and so on. Because the best thing you can do in this situation is keep those factual and accurate notes. So then we, last but not least, have the DFV Workplace Safety Plan. That's on page 32. And what that does is it provides a template of how you can draw the information you've gathered in the assessment into a plan specific to that employee. So the review mechanism for this plan is really important. So plan ahead and book review meetings so that you can be proactive instead of reactive, and identify triggers that might that might indicate you need to schedule an immediate review. So for example, a workplace incident, or if there's increased risk, or if the employee reports that there have been threats made to workplace safety. So on a related note, there are times of increased risk of domestic and family violence, including homicide. And that includes when separating or post-separation, during pregnancy and subsequent to a child's birth, ongoing court matters, and also when reaching out for help. So that's one of the reasons that confidentiality at work is so important, so that the person using violence doesn't learn that the victim survivor is seeking assistance.